Hi everyone! Today I will be giving a brief presentation about the mental health of caregivers. As we all know, mental health is super important to one's well-being and quality of life. However, there are many stressors of life that can worsen mental health, such as being a caregiver of someone with a chronic disease. Having to see someone you know and love struggle can be really hard, and it comes with a lot of grief, as there is little a caretaker can do besides palliative care. In the last few decades, chronic disease care has shifted from hospital inpatient setting to more ambulatory settings. Since long-term inpatient care can be really expensive and uses extensive resources, many people have found it easier to care for patients at home, with much of the stress being placed on caregivers. But only a few studies so far have examined the quality of life of this group of people. The focus of the research that I am presenting is the mental health and disorders of long-term caregivers. It is a very important research topic as it is often neglected. When someone has a chronic disease, most of the focus is placed on the actual patient, which makes sense, so we often forget about the caregivers and how they might be affected too. Caregivers are often praised for their work in caring for others, but there is also some strain placed on their own mental health. There are not too many facilities in place to care for the caregivers themselves. Some common disorders include moderate to severe depression, anxiety, and severe grief. Caregivers are at an elevated risk for developing mental health disorders and should be screened for these conditions. My specific research question explores the significance of psychological mental health issues of caregivers of people with chronic diseases, as well as some of the common reasons behind the distress. Here are some common terms that I will be using and their relative definitions. Caregivers. Caregivers are people who tend to the needs or concerns of a person with long-term limitations due to illness, injury, or disability. In this case, we are going to be discussing caregivers that are mostly friends and family of the patient and are not professionally trained or reimbursed for their time. Also, these caregivers are caregivers by their own choice. Chronic disease. Chronic diseases are defined broadly as conditions that last 1 year or more and require ongoing medical attention or limit activities of the daily living. These can be both psychological and physiological for our purposes today. Quality of life. We will be referring specifically to health-related quality of life. It includes physical and mental health perceptions such as energy level and mood, including health risks and conditions, functional status, social support, and socioeconomic status. Moving on to our first study. In one study, 191 caregivers of patients with advanced cancer were given a questionnaire that asked things like the caregiver's relationship to the patient, the number of hours per day spent providing care, whether caregivers had any chronic illness or disability themselves, people cared for in addition to the patient, or if they had any formal or informal help caring for the patient or experienced any change in their work or living situation following the patient's diagnosis. The SF36V2 is a survey used to measure the mental and physical health. The study found that even though the caregivers were in good physical health, with a score of 50, they had low mental health scores. Their mental health scores averaged 41, below the national average of 50. Thus, there appeared to be considerable mental strain associated with caring for patients with advanced cancer. Some of this stress is associated with simultaneously caring for others and working outside of the home. The study also concluded that caregivers should be receiving care or interventions for their own mental health if necessary. One limitation to the study is that it looked at caregivers from a population that was generally well-educated, of a relatively high income, and predominantly European ethnicity. Moving on to Study 2. The purpose of this study was to contrast the levels of anxiety and depression reported by older Australians providing assistance to someone who is ill, disabled, or elderly with that of non-caregivers, and to identify secondary stressors which explain caregivers' poor mental health. The survey was given to 2,222 adults in Australia, and mental health was assessed using the Goldberg depression and anxiety scales. The results showed that caregivers reported significantly poorer mental health than non-caregivers, and also reported poorer physical health, greater financial stress, greater responsibility for household tasks, and more conflict and less social support from their family and spouse. Some of the associated reasons included their own physical impairment, a lack of social support, and greater conflict. The study also mentioned that research like this can be used to make appropriate changes to the policies and regulations of caregivers. The study helped to establish more evidence that caretakers also suffer from anxiety and depression, as well as some of the common reasons why. One limitation of this study is that it focused on people only in Australia between the ages of 63 and 65. In reality, caregivers can be of any age, and that can affect the generalizations we make. Moving on to the third study. This study explored the impact of stresses on caregivers' mental as well as physical health. The study included 388 family caregivers from southern Taiwan. They were given surveys that assessed their mental health, and they were also tested for ailments like headaches, dizziness, joint pains, insomnia, backache, and stomach discomfort. Basically, the study found that caregivers that had mental health strains also saw an effect on their physical health. Additionally, more hours spent giving care was associated with more mental and physical decline. There was also an association between hours of care given per week and the consequent interference in the caregiver's personal life, such as day-to-day activities, leisure activities, social life, and marriage. Feelings of worry and irritation increased as well. The importance of this study is that it showed the influence of mental health of caregivers on their physical health as well. Not preventing mental health disorders in caregivers can cause serious physical problems as well, which both threaten the quality of life as well as lifespan. Intervention programs for caregivers need to target health in a holistic way. One limitation of this study is that it studied both physical and mental health, so the mental health of the patients may not have fully been assessed. The focus was split between the two components. This last article was not a study, but rather a collection of information that pertains to difficult issues which caretakers of cancer patients routinely faced. It is based on a survey given to caretakers. The article summarizes 5 major stressors behind the distress of caregivers. 1. Troublesome symptoms. Caregivers reported a vague, generalized feeling of helplessness, progressive apathy, and inability to empathize with patients because of feeling emotionally drained. They also reported having mild cold and fevers when particularly stressed, which also supports the conclusion made in Study 3. A significant number of the caregivers noted that they experienced work-related dreams filled with anxiety or guilt themes, particularly during difficult periods. Another reason for distress was not seeing the value of one's work. This can be difficult for caregivers, especially when they are not seeing improvements in their patients. Also, caregivers noted that they did not receive support from other treatment members. Several caregivers noted that patients gave little positive or supportive feedback to them. This led to feeling like giving up and that it was not worth it. Having your work not be appreciated by the patients that you're giving care to can lead to you feeling like it's not worth it and therefore diminish your own work. The third stressor was the guilt associated with omnipotence feelings. Omnipotence is the feeling of having great power. As a caregiver, you have a lot of responsibilities in your hand. This feeling can be overwhelming and therefore associated with guilt. There's a lot that can go wrong, and caregivers might blame themselves for what happens with their patients. The next reason for stress is exclusionary protectivism. This term is used to define a situation in which some aspects of patient's care or condition are specifically kept secret or not discussed with certain individuals for their own protection. Keeping these secrets can lead to long-term stress in caregivers as well as more guilt. Having difficult patients is the last stressor. All patients are different and require varying levels of care. Difficult patients that showed signs of being angry led to the caregivers also feeling stress and feeling like they weren't doing enough. Some caregivers also described feelings of pressure to be perfect in fear of being judged by real professionals. All of the reasons mentioned are causes of stress and anxiety commonly felt by caregivers. As you can see, all of the studies point to the conclusion that caregiving is associated to increased risk of mental health issues as well as overall decreased quality of life. To answer the research question from the beginning, mental health in caregivers is very important because it leads to depression, lower quality of life, higher levels of anxiety, and even physical ailments like headaches, cold, and dizziness. Also, some of the common reasons were just discussed in Study 4. One limitation of all of the studies was that they relied on caregivers to report on themselves. It is hard to answer questions about yourself honestly sometimes, and it can lead to under or overestimated answers that can skew the results. One recommendation is to have the caregivers assessed by 1 to 2 medical professionals and psychologists. This way, the results are less subjective. However, this would be more expensive and take more time to do. One limitation of my presentation is that I was not able to find articles that were too similar. As mentioned before, this topic of psychology is not well studied or experimented on. Therefore, the studies that I chose had varying age groups, regions, and types of diseases patients of the caregivers, such as cancer, had. I think it would have been better to compare studies that used similar groups of people. Caregivers are very important to the healthcare industry, especially in caring for people with chronic conditions, because they are able to provide care outside of the home and using less resources that would otherwise be very expensive. However, we must have proper screenings and guidelines to follow to ensure that caregivers are being helped if necessary. Anyways, I thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.